wine for the forgotten angel. The Lang hills rolled like sleeping giants beneath a sky the color of old pewter. Matteo Ravelli had worked these slopes for 40 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him, coaxing Nebbiolo grapes from the clay and limestone with the patience of a man who understood that great wine could not be hurried. His vineyard sprawled across 3 hectares of prime land, the vines gnarled and ancient, their roots reaching deep into soil that remembered centuries. It was during the autumn harvest of 2019 that Matteo first heard the voice. He had been walking the rows at dawn, inspecting the fruit before the pickers arrived, when a sound stopped him cold, a low hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like a cello bowed in a cathedral vault. The sound had no source, no direction. It simply was, vibrating through the soles of his boots and up through his bones. "Kai va là," he called out, his voice swallowed by the mist. No answer came, only that persistent hum, fatting now like a dream upon waking. By noon, he'd convinced himself it was nothing, wind through the vines, perhaps, or the settling of the earth. But that evening, as he stood in his cantina watching the must ferment in its steel vats, the voice came again. This time, he heard words. "Forgotten, forgotten." The whisper seemed to seep from the concrete floor, from the walls themselves. Matteo's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the vat. He was not a superstitious man. He believed in soil composition and pruning techniques, in the science of fermentation. But he could not deny what he heard. "Who are you?" he asked the empty cellar. Only silence answered, and the soft bubbling of the wine coming into being. The voice grew stronger with each harvest. In 2020, during the pressing, Matteo heard it clearly. "Feed me with your rot, give me your abundance." The words curled through the air like smoke, spoken in a language that was not quite Italian, not quite Latin, but something older, something that predated both. He began to dream of wings, vast, luminous wings that had turned the color of soil, veined with roots like blood vessels, dissolving into the earth. In his dreams, he walked his vineyard at night and found feathers scattered among the vines, feathers that smelled of must and tannin, and something sacred he couldn't name. Matteo told no one. How could he? His wife had died 3 years ago. His son had moved to Milano and rarely called. There was only Matteo and the vines and whatever presence dwelled beneath them. In the spring, he began to notice changes in the vineyard. The vines in the northeast corner, the oldest section, planted by his grandfather in 1947, grew more vigorously than they had in decades. The leaves were darker, more lustrous. But there was something wrong about that vigor, something excessive. The grapes that formed were almost black, their skins thick and waxy, and they hung heavy on the vines like clusters of wet eyes. Yes, the voice whispered when Matteo stood among those vines. Yes, you begin to understand. Understand what? He asked aloud, feeling foolish speaking to empty air. That nothing holy grows without rot. That every resurrection requires a burial. By the 2021 harvest, Matteo could see it. He rose before dawn and walked to the northeast corner. And there, in the place where the voice was strongest, the soil itself seemed to shimmer with a faint, phosphorescent glow. He fell to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, tearing through the earth until his fingernails split and bled. 3 feet down, he found it. Not wings exactly, not anymore. What remained was more like a memory of wings, a fossil of light preserved in clay. The structure was still visible, the terrible span of them, easily 20 feet from tip to tip, the individual feathers compressed into sedimentary layers. The bones had become limestone. The divine flesh had fermented into the soil itself, feeding his vines for who knew how long decades, centuries. Matteo sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his hands stained with dirt and something that glittered like crushed opals. "Now you see," the voice said, and it was directly beneath him, resonating up through the ground. "I fell so long ago that no one remembers my name. I have been food for your vines, drunk in your grandfather's wine, poured out in libations to saints who supplanted me. I have been the secret of your terroir, the mystery in your Barolo. And now, at last, I am strong enough to speak." "What do you want?" Matteo whispered. "To be remembered, to preach my gospel, to teach what I learned in my long decomposition." "What gospel?" The earth around him seemed to pulse, and Matteo smelled fermentation, not the clean, controlled fermentation of his cantina, but something wilder, older, the scent of things breaking down and being remade. That God is found in decay as much as creation, that the rot is holy. That abundance comes from what is buried and forgotten, from what falls and is consumed. I was cast down for speaking this truth in heaven. Here, in your soil, I have proven it." Matteo covered the wings again and staggered back to his house. He did not sleep that night. By morning, he had made his decision. He harvested the grapes from the northeast corners separately, kept them apart from his other fruit. The must was almost black, thick as ink, and it fermented with an unnatural vigor. The scent that rose from the vats was intoxicating and unsettling, notes of cherry and tar and rose, yes, but beneath it something else, something that smelled like incense and iron and the breath of crypts. When the wine was ready, Matteo did not bottle it for sale. Instead, he poured it into terracotta amphorae, the kind his ancestors had used 2,000 years ago, and stored them in the coldest corner of his cantina. The voice came to him more frequently now, no longer just during harvest, but throughout the year. It spoke to him as he pruned in winter, as he tied up new growth in spring, as he managed the canopy in summer. It taught him things no enology textbook contained: how to encourage beneficial decay, how to coax maximum expression from minimal intervention, how to make wine that tasted of earth and transcendence. His wines began to change. Critics who had praised his Barolos for decades now struggled to describe them. Haunting, wrote one. Uncomfortable, wrote another. As if the wine itself is trying to tell you something you don't want to hear. Sales dropped. His son called, worried about the estate. Matteo ignored him. By the autumn of 2024, Matteo was 73 years old, and the angel's voice was constant. A low commentary on everything he did. It no longer frightened him. In truth, he had come to depend on it, this presence that understood the labor of his hands, the love he poured into his vines. Open the amphory. The angel instructed him one October evening as the sun set red over the hills. The wine is ready. Matteo descended to his cantina and unsealed the vessels. The wine inside had transformed. It was no longer entirely liquid. Crystals had formed, geometric and strange, glittering in the lamplight. When he poured a glass, it moved sluggishly, leaving a residue on the sides that resembled wing patterns. He raised the glass to his lips. Drink, the angel commanded, and understand. The wine touched his tongue and Matteo gasped. It tasted of everything at once, every harvest he'd ever worked, every grape he'd ever pressed, every season of his life. But more than that, it tasted of the angel's fall, the long tumbling through centuries of sky, the impact with earth, the slow dissolving into soil. It tasted of being forgotten, of being consumed, of being transformed into nourishment for other lives. It tasted of a gospel he had no words for. Matteo fell to his knees, the glass shattering on the stone floor, wine spreading around him like wings. Now you will tell them, the angel said. You will serve this wine, and through it I will preach. Each sip a sermon, each swallow a sacrament, the gospel of rot and abundance, of falling and feeding, of dying that others might live. They found Matteo 3 days later, curled on the floor of his cantina, surrounded by broken glass and wine that had dried to a dark crust. He was alive, but changed. His eyes held a strange light, and he spoke in sentences that folded back on themselves, paradoxes that hurt to contemplate. He opened his cantina to pilgrims rather than tourists. He served only the angel's wine, only to those who asked for it by name, though he never told anyone what it was called. They came from across the Lange, then from across Italy, drawn by whispers of a wine that showed you what you'd forgotten, that taught you how to find holiness in decay. Some said Matteo had gone mad. Others said he'd found something that had been lost since before the church had names for its saints. His son came once, tasted the wine, and left weeping, unable to explain why. The vines in the northeast corner grew wilder each year, no longer following the neat rows of the rest of the vineyard. They twisted and sprawled, bearing grapes that were too dark, too perfect, too heavy with meaning. Matteo tended them with the devotion of a priest, speaking prayers the angel taught him, liturgies of fermentation and decomposition. And beneath it all, in the soil where the wings had become earth, the angel waited and gathered strength. Each harvest fed it. Each drinker of the wine heard a whisper of its gospel. The forgotten was beginning to be remembered. On clear nights, if you stood in Mateo's vineyard and listened carefully, you could hear the humming, not wind, not settling earth, but something vast and patient singing itself back into existence. One grape, one fermentation, one convert at a time. The gospel of rot and abundance, preached from beneath the soil of the Lange Hills. And every year, the voice grew stronger,